I'll keep an eye on the participant list, but I think it's probably worth starting. So how about, Alex, if I hand over to you, you give us a little introduction, and let's say finish at 1/2 the hour, but it's really up to you. You know, if you're on a roll, that's fine.
I'll try my best.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, so over to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sean. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so I'm Alex May. I'm an artist, mainly working with digital technologies, and specifically this artwork that I'll be talking about today is virtual reality artwork that I made as a commission for Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. And I think Luke Currell is here, who's from the council, who worked with me on the project. Basically, it was an open call, international open call about digital preservation. And if anyone's caught any of my other talks, I've actually talked about digital preservation. It's something that's sort of really kind of close to my heart because of my practice, and you know, directly impacts the work that I do, and it's sort of actually become a sort of something that's informed the work. So when this commission came up, I applied for it straight away, and it was interesting sort of designing this commission, because part of the thing was not just to sort of talk about digital preservation, but it was to actually sort of put the money where the mouth is and actually be taken into the collection of the museum. And the challenge was to make it last for 20 years minimum. So this was, so I wanted to do something which was not sort of just a very simple thing. Like, I mean, if I could have just done a print or done a sort of video that would be sort of viewed on a screen, something that would be sort of easily preservable in a way, but something that was a little bit more challenging. So I wanted to sort of do something using virtual reality. But this obviously had to be planned quite carefully because you know, technology comes and goes, and so if it was going to last for even 5 years, it would need to be done in a sort of certain way. So I've sort of done a lot of talks about this, and I've written software. Some of you have probably seen my Fujio software, which is a sort of trying to embody digital preservation designs actually in a sort of code level. I mean, what I've sort of come to realize is that when you're designing any kind of digital project, whether it's art or otherwise, the choices you make day one pretty much define the longevity of the project. I was watching the Cinedoc New York, the film by Charlie Kaufman, and they have that recurring quote, "The end is built into the beginning." And I thought this was a really nice sort of succinct summation of that kind of idea. So if you start sort of thinking about what technologies you're going to use, it actually really, if you have a desire for your work to last a long time, you suddenly find your options are quite limited. And I think the idea of sort of digital preservation should be something that's a democratized thing. I mean, we have a very strong maker culture. People are sort of encouraged to learn to code, and I think, you know, we should pay mind in sort of to keeping things as well, and making things last for a long period. It is a very difficult thing to teach because it is immediately a very complicated discussion from, as I say, from day one. It's like, you know, people sort of choose, well, I'm going to do something on Unity, and you say, well, actually, yeah, but Unity won't probably function in the same way as in 10 years as it does now. How are you going to keep that working? And it's quickly quite, especially if people are less technically orientated can make them quite depressed. This is quite a nice piece of digital preservation I found in Anna's parents' garden. Some of you will probably remember these AOL, join AOL CDs that is now being used as a bird scarer, which I thought was quite nice. This is actual sort of, I mean, the interesting thing about digital preservation is often it isn't visible kind of from the outside. It's sort of you see physically, you see the medium, but you don't see the data. This image, I went with Luke to the tape stores in a secret location, and this was one shelf of their media section. These are all Bruce Nauman installation. This is, I think it's one installation, multiple tapes, multiple screens, and they've got lots of hard drives and tapes and whatever, and you can't, apart from the labels, you can't see what's going on. I mean, it's not just a digital thing, it's sort of like a new media thing, like whether these are tapes or whatever, they're kind of removed from the actual information that's on there. And this is the fundamental issue with digital preservation, is that it's still a question of preserving objects. We still have to preserve tapes and media and hard drives and computers and whatever. But there's this extra level where we need to preserve the means of reading and accessing the information and then processing it. And I was very struck by the 5G towers getting burned down. Like this sort of, almost like a sort of dark age kind of witchcraft. People don't get technology to a very deep level, and why should they? But they don't sort of necessarily understand the complexities or the way it works, or why it should fail or not, or how this, I mean, especially with something like the cloud, people sort of think that you put your data in the cloud and it's in some sort of magical kingdom that is fine for all eternity, but it's just another hard drive in a bigger computer. So the artwork, the challenges I was talking about, I wanted to create something that was sort of platform agnostic, which is not obviously the same as technology agnostic. It is a virtual reality piece. It is something to be viewed in a stereoscopic 360 environment. It was, as I say, to be accessioned to the museum's collection. So that was another conversation which we're still having about, how does this piece get, put into the collection. And it quickly became quite clear that it could be accessed in many, many different ways. There's not just the end result, which is fundamentally just a video file. There's all the 3D scans, and which I'll talk about later. And there's plenty of opportunities to use this data in lots and lots of different ways, especially with the situation with the museum in Tunbridge Wells, which is part of the reason why they're doing these commissions, is because they've just got this large grant to rebuild the whole thing, and so the building's closed for 3 years. So part of the project is to get outside the walls of the museum, reach new audiences, reach an international audience, and this was part of the design of the piece. And fundamentally, the part of the thing is to make clear the difference between digital preservation of physical objects, i.e. scanning existing artifacts from a collection for long-term preservation, and the preservation of native digital artifacts. So if I write a piece of code, that's obviously different. That's always been digital, so, rather than something that becomes digital. And at the moment, there's this really incredible surge of new VR technology, driven a lot by Facebook and Oculus, and the new, or still relatively new. Oculus Quest is quite amazing piece of technology. They've just introduced hand tracking, so you can just put your hands out in front of you and see your fingers in front of you. They've, you know, the kind of balance of speed and power, and I'm really sold on it. I don't mean to do a sort of sales thing, but it's, you know, I've followed VR all the way back from sort of, you know, trying virtuality and it's really got to the point where it's really usable and cost effective, and so I really wanted to use that as a technology for the work. And I also used mainly Blender, which if you've not come across it, it's a 3D modeling package, but completely open source, and it's been around for 20 years, and it's got an incredible community. It's got an office in Amsterdam, I think, and full-time developers, and it's got lots of industry support. So I thought if I based it on this sort of venerable software, it would have a chance of lasting another 20 years because it's really you know, doing very well. So all the files that I'm generating could be taken in and re-rendered out. So the idea is that, you know, when you get the next generation of headsets with even more resolution in each eye, then you could re-render out the whole thing, even if I wasn't around, which and the other piece of software that I was using is this 3ds Zephyr for doing photogrammetry. So this is a process of taking photos of a object in the world. In this case, a car. This isn't one of mine, but this is sort of demonstrative of the process. You take a bunch of photos and then you feed it into the software. The software crunches them all down and creates a 3D model out of the 2D photos that you fed in. There's lots of software for doing this, but this is the one that I was using, and it worked really well. So I would go up to Tunbridge Wells, and with Luke, we'd sort of raid the collection for lots of different artifacts, and then we would scan them using this sort of photogrammetry technique. So this is the kind of setup that I was using. So it's a sort of, I think it's a 1 meter cubed light box with a turntable in it and a camera, and you know, turn it 10 degrees, and then you take a photo, you turn it 10 degrees, and you build up a library of images of an object. You turn it over, you do it again, and then you feed it all into the software afterwards. So this would be an example of the kind of photos that I was taking. This is an iguanodon bone, which has actually been, was in 3 different sections. So I scanned each section individually. This is just some shots of the reconstruction of one of the sections. So you see the quality of the mesh is pretty high. The texture reconstruction is pretty good. And I had this idea that this would be quite a nice metaphor for something that I could actually reconstruct. So I wanted to take these sections of this bone and put them together again into what would then become a digital object that had not been in physical existence in our lifetimes. Although once it was all one part. I don't know for sure when it broke apart, but it looks like it's been that way for a long time. So this is the result. This is a rendering of the reconstructed iguanodon bone. And I wanted to use this. This is the very first scene of the artwork. It begins in this cave where you travel into the cave, and you see the bone embedded into the wall at the back of the cave, and this sets a lot of the tone of the piece. You'll notice there's a lot of detail. It's a very high resolution rendering. I really wanted to have this sort of balance between sort of natural forms, you know, this sort of rock textures and the bone and everything, but always having this nod to the digital stuff. So the cracks in the wall are actually a sort of Voronoi pattern, and some of you can sort of see triangles and the mesh sort of breaking through the walls of the cave. And you start at night, and you start with the sun rising behind you, and it's casting the light that reveals this bone. And this was very much about the idea of light being the bringer of knowledge, and darkness being the shadows of ignorance. It's Plato's cave, basically, and the idea that the three guys are down here somewhere in the dark pit, and then one sort of gets out and sees the light and learns about the world, and I sort of thought this idea of light was a really strong kind of metaphor for knowledge, and the preservation of these things, which are basically preserving knowledge for our generation, for future generations. Because it's very, we've never seen dinosaurs, but we have these bones and we have these records that are way, before humans ever existed in any form. We're lucky we have them, because although there are a lot of them, they had to be preserved in a very specific way for them to last. The idea that excuse me, that light brings knowledge is sort of interesting now, because with science, with the tools that we create, with microscopes, with or telescopes even, or things which allow us sight beyond our human abilities. The sun has kind of, which is obviously the natural source of heat and light, has been replaced by the eye of science, and the ability to sort of see beyond our own physical things. And this sort of also relates to sort of along the time axis. So I wanted to kind of reference these ideas in this artwork. This is the Bone Museum. So the video basically takes this form of several scenes. Each one is a sort of roughly this kind of strange museum type idea in this very expansive, flat environment. They're quite dreamlike. They're sort of referencing sort of landscapes by Dali, and that idea of sort of there's just this endless nothingness out there, but you're experiencing these kind of monumental occurrences in the landscape. The light is still very dark. The sun hasn't risen yet. This is beyond our real understanding. So as you go into the temple, or into the museum rather, you find the three sections of the bone on plinths inside the thing. So it sort of starts to reference the transition of sort of time, and the idea of relics and artifacts, and how these are preserved. I like the idea of a sort of memento mori kind of thing, because obviously we're talking about having this idea of preserving things beyond our years, beyond our own personal existence. It's interesting how we're so fixated on creating things. We have tools, the likes of which are just amazing, and we can create things faster and quicker than ever. We can distribute them internationally in microseconds, and they can be consumed just as quickly. And this is an amazing situation, but we have very little concern for legacy and preservation. We just kind of assume these things are going to happen. This data is going to remain on server sort of indefinitely. But so the memento mori sort of idea that to remind us that of our own longevities, but at the same time I really like I use the Piltdown man skull, which is as a fake, and it isn't a sort of real. And it's a sort of reminder that none of this is real. That all of these sort of virtual things have no sort of physical presence. That they are sort of outside of time and outside of our sort of everyday existence, and a sort of direct control. This is the sort of scene which is sort of talking. These are pantiles, which are the sort of tiles which Tunbridge Well is famous for. It used to have these streets paved with these tiles, and they've all obviously been torn up, but we scanned some and I've recreated this this floor with them. And these cages are for crickets. People would, there's only one, but obviously I've replicated it. And this scene was very much about sort of the idea that we're sort of making a prison for ourselves with this sort of idea of creating things and of consuming things, and this sort of need that we have as for this sort of endless cycle, and that, you know, we're not necessarily kind of aware of it. There's sort of the scene sort of takes you almost into one of these things. And also there's this house, this doll's house, which is modelled on the one that's in the Tunbridge Wells collection. When I was sort of doing initial research, and these people were sort of saying they want to go inside the doll's house, and you actually do get to go inside, although it's actually quite plain inside, and I didn't. It's sort of you get to sort of sit in this with this doll's house furniture, and the video sort of ends on this mirror, which is this render doesn't actually have a reflective surface, but in the final thing there's this sort of semi-reflective surface which is quite dull and quite. You can see it is a mirror, but it's very dull, and it's that idea of you know, that if we don't have a clear reflection of ourselves, then you know, if we don't preserve these things for future generations, then what people see of us will not be kind of clear, and this is kind of quite maybe a unique experience that we have to think about with this rapid consumption of culture. You know, normally things that are sort of roughly important will last, will be preserved. Should we be thinking about preserving work, our own work, and in a sort of very conscientious way, because of the rate of consumption? I mean, you know, there are parallels to how we treat the environment, and you know, these things cannot go on, cannot scale ad infinitum. At some point we have to sort of take responsibility and incorporate these concerns into the way we work. Obviously digitization, photogrammetry doesn't work for all objects. As I found, I was really trying to get this kind of box. There's this sort of stuffed dog in there, which is all furry, and it didn't work out very well at all, but it's quite pretty. This is about as best as I could get, but you can see the so this idea that you know, digital does not preserve everything. It's there is a sort of native sort of you know, there are essences where it's very, very good, and there are some things where it's kind of just awful. I actually use this, and I scanned these tiny little Sabutio figures, or there was actually just one, and it's very, very small. It's like this sort of big, and it just didn't turn out well at all. But I actually used this as a sort of metaphor of kind of lies. So these are sort of there's a sort of lies coming into the world, and this is the Museum of Lies. Like, you know, when we preserve all this data, you know, should we be clear about what is fake and what is true? And you know, because these things permeate so quickly, again, through the internet, fake news and all these kind of ideas. Where is the responsibility for preserving that and labeling that as something which should be understood further in the future. So just a bit of technical information about the piece. This is kind of one frame of the video. It's a stereoscopic video at 4096 by 4096 pixels, 25 frames a second. So that's 4096 by 2048 per eye. And this is using this sort of equi-rectangular projection. So this is, so you can look 360 all the way around you, up and down, and it's all in 3D. Obviously this, I'm trying to show you this because it's very difficult to give you an idea of actually how it looks over Zoom, because it's not going to work. This is some more details from the one of the photogrammetry scans. So this is a fern fossil. This is how it looks rendered. This is the texture file. And then these are extra data like the normals, which are describe the directions of all the little surfaces, and this is the displacement map, which gives more data, more roughness, more surface detail. Now, talking with Tunbridge Wells about how we share this information, and I think this one, I can't remember, Luke, I'll have to check, is up on a website to download. So the idea that you can sort of take this and use it for other purposes is quite an interesting proposition. We took one and 3D printed it in this sort of charcoaly black sort of material. So this item is also going to be taken into the collection alongside the original fossil and the digital version. So it's kind of not just the work itself, but it's also sprouting all these other kind of ways of processing and storing and sharing the information, which is basically between myself and Luke and other members of the museum, we've had some really interesting conversations about the longevity of the piece and the legacy of the piece, rather, and what can be done with it. And we've done, or rather they've done these sort of outreach sessions with local groups. There's sort of been some quite young, sort of 11 to 16-year-olds, and some, you know, more elderly, sort of 60 to 75, getting them to try the piece out and sort of asking them what they sort of thought of it. So that's a sort of kind of overview of piece and a bit more about sort of about how it was made. There's the main website is amirrorforremembering.com. So there's more information about that. The trailer for the piece is on there, which you can watch in 3D, either in a VR headset or with a phone, cardboard, Google Cardboard sort of thing. That's my website as well, and all my social media things, which would be great to connect and all that usual stuff. Yeah. And I guess any questions at this point?
Okay, I've just unmuted myself. Maybe I could ask a quick couple of questions while people have a think about the things they want to raise. I have a question about the work itself. It feels like it's actually creating digital objects to add to the collection. I was just wondering, how do you imagine these objects might be preserved and presented in the future?
The scans, you mean?
Yes, so then the scans get put into the collection. Is that the idea? They become part of the collection. Do you have any?
Yeah, so the original part of the original proposal was that I would supply this video file at the end of it. It's this sort of 10-minute video experience, plus all of the assets that go into making it. So this is absolutely everything. This is all the 3D models, all the scans, all the photogrammetry images. I was really keen to share everything. So, you know, it's about 200 gigs of data to share, with a understanding that this data could be used by the museum in interesting and sort of explorative ways. So the sharing of the 3D objects and things as sort of, it wasn't initially the idea, but it's sort of come out of the discussions that we've had, and I'm sure there are going to be lots of other ways of sharing the data as well. Okay,
and then before we open up to everyone, you talked about digital preservation at the beginning, and that's something that a number of us have been talking about recently. How do you preserve the artwork? And one of the conclusions I'm sort of coming to is that as well as preserving the piece, you need to preserve as much context as possible. And that might range from interviews with the artists, interviews with viewers, recordings of people experiencing the work. And have you done some of that as well?
For this piece, yeah. I mean, all of the proceeds and the the notes and the meetings that we've had and the interviews that I've done, and and the website that we've set up. I mean, it's there's work to be done on it, but it's a start to sort of try and collate everything that's happening around the piece, and I'm going to be writing up some more sort of information about what it is and how everything's structured, and sort of so the idea is to create as much of this context around it as possible.
And do you think that context will include maybe a sort of a recorded discussion or some information about what that piece means at this moment in time?
Yeah, I think
because 3D scanning and VR are all very new, and that's part of the interesting nature of the artwork, but in 20 years time they may not be. So how do you capture that sense that this is something new and something that people haven't seen before?
Well, that's not really what I'm, because it's, I'm using the technology because it's got to a level that allows me to do what I want, which is to take somebody and put them in a completely enveloping sort of situation. But it's not about the new. It's not. It's just. I mean, we've all known about VR for I don't know 20 years plus, but it's only just got to the point where it's kind of usable, and from this point on, it will be usable. So, I think the piece isn't about VR or anything like that. It's about, so it will still be valid in 20 years time, I hope. The conversation will have moved on, but it's not focused. It's not. That's what I meant about being kind of platform agnostic, and it's not sort of linked to any one sort of specific way of doing it.
Yeah. Okay, so if anybody else has any questions, I think what you'd need to do first would be to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. Okay. So we have Graham. So I'm just checking. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay. You still look muted. I can do it from here.
All right, okay.
Oh, Graham, there you go. I've unmuted you.
Right, you can hear me. Oh, it's really good. Okay. Some of the folks around here will know that I've been working an awful lot myself through EVA London with the idea of trying to send digital photographs 300 years, 500 years into the future. And the answer has been pigment ink printing and so on, which is a reasonably obvious one, but much of what you've said tonight, Alex, actually singing from the same hymn sheet, that digital data has a shorter life. It's, mine started out that Victorian photographers make things in silver enveloped in gelatin, and that is far longer lasting than dye based in acetate, which will get the vinegar effect and attack and destroy itself within 50 or 70 years from now. And the digital data, if we make it 25 years on digital data on any photographs, we'll be bloody lucky. So a lot of what I've done is actually to say, let's go back to some basics. Let's go back to old technology, like 13th century technology, where we had pigments being painted on papyrus or acid-free paper, to actually send 500 years into the future. And I've done some stuff with that as some of you know, with University College Oxford and so on. I think you're absolutely dead right in what you're talking about, that artists aren't thinking enough about this in future. I happened to do a lecture for the Royal College of Art as part of event 2, which was that all artists should actually be saving their work to paper once every 10 years in their career. Maybe they should be doing a blurb book or something which uses pigment inks into a Mohawk paper or something like that, so that they actually record themselves for future posterity. It's probably less of a question and more of a discussion that I've done. But is this something that other people actually think is important? Because I certainly do.
I mean, just to respond to you, because that idea about kind of almost limiting the media that you use to ensure preservation is obviously one sort of very valid way of doing it. But it means that if you wanted to use, if I write a piece of code, I mean, do I print that out in a book? Do I print out the source code listing, or do I, I mean, it becomes a sort of Sol LeWitt kind of, sort of algorithmic kind of thing. But what if my code interfaces with a Google API that stops working after a while, and that obviously that is not you can't document that. So
I started to have this talk with some folks at the V&A last year when they were doing the Digital Design Weekend, and Tom Ensign, who was going to be one of our keynotes at Eva London this summer, had we run it, was going to be part of this. And one of the things that sort of came out of it was we understand all Newton's thinking because he published his workings in print. And I do think that a lot of coding that people are doing, if people put it down into print and pigment ink printing and books and sent it into the future, then somebody, whatever the technology is in the future, would be able to understand and read the code. It's like reading why Newton thought his maths was right the way he did until Einstein came along. But basically, they'd be able to understand it and reproduce the concept of it in whatever is the technology then.
I would agree. Personally, I think one of the interesting things as an artist, often it's about process. What you're doing is about a process, and that process is not obviously contained within the final object you produce. So you might produce a beautiful thing, but that doesn't necessarily capture the process. And I think increasingly it's important for people to document their processes, and that becomes part of the documentation of the artwork. Originally, in early computer art, of course, Ernest, I think it's still Ernest Edmonds, told me this, that people used to stick their print listings next to their artwork when they exhibited the pieces. So you actually got to see the process, the thing that made the artwork, and the artwork itself. Okay, do we have any more questions? No. Someone has just unmuted. Benjamin?
Hi, how you doing, guys and ladies? Thanks for the talk and putting this together. I'm part of a university team from Aalborg University at the moment, and our current project is starting up a prototype library to preserve virtual reality art. And one of the things we've been looking at is whether we should index the artworks, how should we index the artwork, or whether we should make it completely random. And so that's why we're joining the call today. There's a couple of other members of my group who are also listening into this. So we're coming across this idea of indexing digital art as a big problem for us right now in our project. Previously, I've been a musician which has had to transfer across several different pieces of technology in order to move my music from one thing to the next to the next. Now we've arrived at WAV format for producing sound, but and it seems to have stabilized there. So can we see a point at where what digital code is supposedly the perfect copy? Why are we relying on the technology to be able to read that and reproduce it all the time? Why is the code not able to be reproduced by the different technologies going through time if it's such a perfect copy? There's an irony there that I see. Any thoughts on that?
Because there's no commercial advantage. I mean, companies don't, you know, Apple don't want to make a laptop that lasts 10 years or, you know, so there's this sort of built-in obsolescence that you know, that, I mean, it's very hard to sort of write a piece of code and finish it, you know, and then not keep adding features and not keep adding, you know, if you stop developing a library, for instance, then it kind of, people stop using it. People like code that's actively developed. So things move on and then things break, and you know, it's very, very difficult to you know, sort of ensure that things are going to last unless you sort of take a snapshot. And that's another approach for digital preservation, is you know, you mothball the computer and the software and the hardware and everything you need, and you don't touch it and you don't upgrade it, and you just, but that's not really how technology is, and that's where the problem is, because we've got this fundamental desire by fundamentally a very small group of people for long-term preservation of digital culture, you know, i.e. artists, musicians, you know, creative people, and the massive, you know, transcontinental industries that are constantly wanting you to buy the next thing. And those two are fundamentally opposed at the moment. And I think that's, you know, but we can't say to people, don't use the latest technologies, don't use things because they're difficult to preserve. But I suppose, you know, where I'm coming from is like, if you could just make that choice knowingly, you know, if preservation's important to you, then you have to look deeper and you have to plan, and you have to, you can't expect Microsoft to do it for you, you know. So I think, I mean, you know, I'm not making this artwork as a sort of to offer any kind of concrete solutions to anyone, because it's, you know, your project obviously is very, very specific and you know, has its own needs and everything. You will find a way of doing it, but it's you know, it's not an easy road to do that.
No, I agree. At the moment, the virtual reality software or hardware we've been using is HTC Vive, because that's what the university has for us to use. How quickly is that going to be useless or obsolete? You know, is a question we're asking ourselves. It's very difficult to know if the work we're putting into the library is going to be worthwhile in 2 years, let alone 5, without constantly updating the work. You know, so it'd be nice to get some input with respect to that. Yeah.
Maybe a relevant thought is that a while ago I recovered a piece of VR work. I wouldn't call it an artwork. It was a piece of VR modeling that I did in the very early 90s. And the way I managed to recover that was because I built it for a system called Render 386, which, while it was quite popular amongst a small community, it wasn't like a full-blown standard, but there were tools within that to export it to the standard of the time, which was something called VRML. And then from VRML, I converted it to something else. And then with about 3 or 4 steps, I got it back into Unity, so it could be used in a contemporary VR system. And so that's 25 years roughly, in fact, maybe a bit more than that, I think, that piece. And I was able to recover I'll pop the URL in the comments. I was able to recover a piece of VR. And so I think it's really important to use as close to standards as possible. So Unity is very widely used. So I wouldn't call it an esoteric system. It's not something that's going to disappear. But there are also things that are trying to come out as standards, like the web VR technologies and A-frame and things like that. And I would have thought if you're building for preservation, you probably at least want to have a copy of your piece or your artwork in something like that, which has a good chance of being usable in 20, 25 years' time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? I'm going to ask somebody who happens to have their mic unmuted, which is Jeff, who I can see in front of me, Jeff Davis, because your project, of course, is you're bringing work sort of back to life, but you're representing work that you made in the 1980s on computers, ZX Spectrum and BBC computers. How's your journey been in trying to get that work to run on contemporary systems?
It was actually fairly easy because we used emulators, and there are many emulators available. The BBC Micro and the ZX Spectrum were very popular at the time amongst what would probably be called a sort of hacker community now. Just lots of people started working with them. So there's still a popularity even now, many years later. So emulators have been made. There's at least 4 or 5 that I tried out with my old code, and some of them work incredibly well. You can increase the screen size, you can speed it up and slow it down, you can do screen dumps, you can make videos. It's all really easy to use, and the emulators did serve the job very well of recreating it. I do have an old ZX Spectrum, and it was a problem getting a monitor, and it was a real drag, and it's so small. It was actually better working with the emulators than with the original. Now, whether this applies to other digital systems, I mean, these were very popular systems. That's the thing. They weren't small community systems at all. It was a huge user base at the time of people writing code, usually games. I mean, I was involved in an arts group, so we did a lot of animated graphics and conceptual pieces, but they all came out very well while using emulators. Whether this applies to other systems, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned VRML, because I did some VRML work in the 90s, and we actually had a VRML art gallery that you could go into and look at things on the walls. This was quite a popular thing at the time, similar in a way to what's happening now, in a more sophisticated way. This was all fairly flat planes, almost like a big tent. You go in, look at the art, which was all fairly straightforward, low res sort of stuff. And it was just a demo. I used to run a small digital production company in the early days of the web in the 90s. And we just used this as a demo on the website. And it was very, people liked it. But I think VRML has disappeared now, hasn't it? Or been turned into something else. Sean, you'd know more about it than me.
Well, it's still out there. The nice thing is that the format is relatively simple. So if the artwork or whatever it was worked in that, you can pretty much guarantee you can get it to work in a contemporary system. And it's a bit like, I imagine what the work Alex has done needs state-of-the-art equipment at the moment. It needs a VR headset and so on. But maybe there will be HTC Vive emulators for future VR systems and that sort of thing. That's why I wanted to bring you in, actually, because I think the role of the emulator in helping us maintain and represent historic artworks is important, but it's not a catch-all, because the emulator will emulate the running software, but it's still visually, sound-wise, not the same as running it on the original piece of kit. And so there's that mixture of the two. You have the emulator can run the software, but you probably need to preserve the hardware as well to get an authentic presentation of the work.
In terms of the small computers in the UK, there's quite a few sort of private computer museums around. There's one in Swindon, there's one in Ramsgate. They're just privately owned collections, people's collections presented to the public. They're open, 3 days a week or something, and they have a newsletter, and they're quite popular. That's all grassroots stuff, you see, rather than being top end, museums funding, state funding. It's like, and that might apply in VR in the future once the tools are out there, because obviously the prices have. I mean, I've been following VR for a long time, but now the prices have come down, so it's more accessible now than it was, I think. The other thing about emulators, why not? The whole idea of computing is that you have a sort of universal machine. So therefore, this universal machine should be able to run anything you put into it. And I think that's something else to aim for from a computational angle, is to have it like a museum of computer programs or programming or whatever, which would run anything you put into it. put a VR program in, it will work. Put a Spectrum program, a COBOL program, whatever. But whether that's an interesting line, I think, where then the whole thing could be presented some sort of public access VR world. It's going off a tangent slightly.
Yeah, and maybe another point that somebody raised a bit earlier is about why can't you just type it in and it works? Well, because the problem with modern computers is that there's so much that's done in order to allow the simple things to happen. I have a computer over my shoulder. It's Commodore PET that I'm doing some work on. You can take a printout and type in hello world, go to 10, hello world. 2 lines of basic code and it will run. But trying to do a hello world program on a modern computer, you have to have the operating system and then the environment for the programming and so on. So as computers become more powerful, even the simple things require a lot to be in place before you can do it. Simple computers were great. They could only do one thing at a time anyway. They didn't really have an operating system as such. So imagine, Alex, with your piece, that I think the problem could be that even if you somehow had an emulator or something, there might still be issues about getting the versions of software right and everything. It's beyond being a simple thing to emulate. It's probably quite a complicated thing to emulate already.
Well, it's not a code at all. There's no code in it. I mean, that was the idea.
So it's models. You would say the models. The artwork is in the models, and the
artwork is the final rendered video. And I've also got all of the individual frames of the video as PNGs. So it's not even needing to be I mean, you could re-encode that as a different kind of video. As I say, with all the models and everything, you could re-render it out as 8K per eye or 16K per eye. So it doesn't matter if it's an Oculus or a Vive, and you can watch it on a Google Cardboard, you can watch it on Gear VR. It doesn't need, because it's a video, it doesn't need any particular hardware. So this was all by design because of all of these issues. But it's obviously the thing that you lose with that is that it's not interactive. You can't change your position or, but it's in terms of what the artwork needs to do, it does it. I think it achieves its aims.
I just noticed a question popped up there. I think the point someone's making here is that sometimes the documentation is the only thing left of the artwork. And I would agree. Sometimes I do wonder if some digital artworks are almost like performances. You can never recapture the original, but you can capture the performance, or you can document the performance anyway. Okay, well, I did say I'd try and keep this down to about an hour, and it is an hour now. We could certainly, if there were some people who wanted to carry on chatting, we can. If some people wanted to leave, that's fine. But before we do, I wonder if Alexander could tell us a little bit about next week's talk.
Okay, thanks, Sean. I'm going to talk about Edward Ignatowicz, his archive in particular. So it follows on very well with this talk. I've been interested in his work for many years now, and set up a website 20 years ago, which I haven't touched since, and it's preserved. It still works because it's in raw HTML, which is kind of funny, going on from what we were just saying. But I recently, just before Christmas, I gathered together all the remaining artifacts at his widow's house that Olga had kept from his work, because she was at the time very ill, and Richard Ignatowicz, Edward's son, was worried that the archive might get sort of locked up in legal issues if she passed away. So we've packaged it all up, and we're storing it temporarily before hopefully moving to the CAS archive. And I just wanted to talk a bit about his work. If you're not familiar with it, I think a lot of you are familiar, so I'll talk a bit about that, but talk more about his archive, what we've got left, what's preserved, what's not. There's some interesting things there about, many of you know the Censter the robot sculpture. We've got the program listing for that on paper, and that's the only way that we know actually what was going on inside it. So that goes back to Graham's sort of point earlier on about printing things out on paper. Also, he did lots of graphics works, which I think people are less familiar with, and I'll talk a bit about that as well.
Great. Okay, well, that'll be for next week. Oh, was there somebody else wanted to say something? No. Well, I think the final thing before we maybe go very informal is to say thanks very much to Alex May for a very interesting talk. You can do some remote clapping.
Thanks very much for having me, Sean. All virtual claps.
Yeah. So I will take this video, and unless anyone objects, they can mail me. I'll put the whole thing on, including the questions, and I'll make sure it's on the Computer Arts Society website and Facebook group. Hopefully everyone has access to one or both of those. Now, we have actually got a little schedule together of talks, and I think we're going to continue to do this weekly for as long as people are interested in attending. So we have 4 coming up, and they are, so I'll get it right, again, they're on the CAS website. So Alex this week, next week, Alexander. Then we have Esther Rollinson, who's here. She's, for me, up at the top row there. And then the week after that, we have Ernest Edmonds, who I think is listening in. I can certainly see him there. There's scope, obviously, for more talks. And I'm sure, because there are quite a few people here I haven't actually met before, and I'm sure there are some very interesting people here who could maybe volunteer a talk as well. So if, oh, it's very early in Sydney, so, right. I'd be more than happy if you want to drop me a line, and maybe my email address, SeanC, SCANC @cuttlefish.com. So if you don't necessarily want to say anything now, I'm just typing that into the comments. And I'd be really interested in any proposals for additional talks. What we've suggested for the format, because we didn't really know how it would work in Zoom, is that you could keep the talks down to 20 minutes if you like. I'm more than happy for them to be longer than that, but I don't want to put people under pressure. And then afterwards we'll have some questions and then open chat for people who want it. So like I say, look on the CAS website, and I'll post this on the Facebook group. We have 4 coming up, but I'd like to maybe get the next 4 booked in. So perhaps drop me a line if you've got something interesting to talk about. Okay, so I think that's the formal bit done, but I'm going to stick around online. So if people want to just carry on having a chat. I don't know if Nick Lambert, I can see down there, who's the chair of CAS, wants to say anything. Art in Flux would be very good, actually. I feel like a bit like a sort of an online DJ or something. I mean, I'm getting this, here we have Afra from London, but Alex, sorry, Afra, I suggested that Flux could do a talk. That would be really good. That'd be very good. I might even, let's talk about that, but I might put you down as the next one after Ernest. Okay.
I'm researching machine learning at the moment at UAL, so I could do a quick talk about that, possibly.
Great, that sounds good to me as well.
In machine learning for poetry and fiction, those sort of areas, not image-based, but that'd be,
and of course,
might make me do some focused work, which would be good.
And we should be doing your exhibition of micro arts towards the end of the year, which hopefully is still okay with everything going on. Yeah, sure. We've still got it in the schedule. Yeah,
whenever it comes available, really, isn't it? Whenever it's possible. Yeah, sure. That's great.
Okay. But anybody, I was just about to ask Nick if you wanted to say anything, because Nick being the chair of Computer Arts Society. I don't know if you've got anything you want to say, Nick, or are you happy listening?
Oh, I'm just to say I'm pleased the experiment's going well. I said last week that you know, I think this has potential, and in fact we're getting even more people than we usually have at a physical CAS meeting. So I'm just sort of thinking this might be a focus for us in the future. Whatever happens outside, we should look at continuing these online chats. I think they're going pretty well so far.
Yeah. And somebody I noticed was in here, hopefully she still is Sue Gollifer. Is Sue still around? Oh yes, I can see you up there. I'd be interested in hearing a talk from you at some point, Sue.
Yeah, I've just got so much going on at the moment because, you know, the university is saying business as usual, you know, so I'm doing all of my admissions and working for ISEA, and, you know, so it's pretty full on. So my office is now my bedroom.
Yeah. Well, if come May, if you're not quite so busy, I'm more than happy to schedule something. So just drop me a line. Hopefully you can carry on coming to these anyway over the weeks.
Yeah.
I think Andy Lomas, when we met last week, Andy was, I think, interested in doing something. We shall see if he can come up with a time that suits. Okay. This is interesting because there's more than one screen of people, so I'm moving between the screens. Oh, okay. I was trying to work out why some people are on both screens. It's because there aren't exactly two screens full. So, yeah. Yeah. Are there any others who at this point want to volunteer? Otherwise, send me an email. I don't want to put people under pressure. Some messages there. Right. Okay. Well, if people feel that we've come to our natural conclusion for today, I'll say thanks again to Alex. That was really interesting. I think it brought up some interesting issues. And we shall meet same time next week. So that's 8 o'clock on the Tuesday, UK time. I'm sure it's different times for many people. And like I say, keep an eye out for this talk and for the future presentations that we've now got a nice list of. Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Very good.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Coming.
Okay, right. I shall end the meeting.
Take care.
Bye.
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 Goodbye.
Well, actually, before I got to cancel Roger before you disappear. Oh, Roger has disappeared. Okay.
Okay, bye.
See you.